first lesson in navigation is know where you are. Revelation, very simply, is about knowing where you are and knowing what world we live in. We live in the shadow of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, and that's very different from living in the shadow of an oppressive culture or regimes. The simplest expression of revelation, Jesus has already won, and one day we'll see it. And that makes a massive difference to how you live in the world. If you think Caesar has won, if the battle is still going on, that affects you very differently in terms of how you live in the world.
Welcome to this week's Calling a City to Life, a podcast by Queen's Park Baptist Church in Glasgow. I was prompted by a particular person that I should be using the phrase g'day, rather than worrying about whether it was morning, afternoon or evening, because g'day covers everything. I can't do an Australian accent.
If you're Australian, no, you really can't. So let's move
I did
along.
wonder whether it should be more Edwardian and it should be good day, everybody. Good day and welcome to Calling a City to Life. Iain, Brody,
option.
Any preferences on how we should be greeting everybody this morning?
I think that's definitely an improvement, Richard. I think good day is actually a much improved welcome to the podcast. I just kind of wanted to do maybe a little bit of a shout out just to, so for folks joining us. So I just want to welcome all kitchen cleaners, dog walkers, car drivers and keep fitters who are particularly listening to us on the podcast. It's great to have you and everybody else as well.
And would they be generally listening to us in the morning, perhaps?
They are listening all of the time at many given times.
24/7 podcasting.
Through the good day.
Through the good day. Brody, how is your day so far? Is it proving good?
It was a nice, dry, cool walk in to work. So, no, I didn't have to battle my way through football fans just yet. That's this evening's joy.
Oh, that's tonight, yes. Should we be closing in prayer at the end of this recording for the Scotland football team? Is that appropriate?
No. The rugby team, perhaps, but the football team, who cares?
Controversial.
It's very controversial.
Oh, there we go. There's our first.
That has lost half of the podcast listeners just in one breath.
Yeah.
No.
Anyway,
See,
yes.
but the algorithms will pick that up and it'll boost us.
That's right. We'll just put in the title why Christians should hate sport or something like that, and that'll get the algorithms working. Chasey egg ball is not as good as roundy football. Anyway, right. Well, thank you to Nick for giving us our new intro. We'll see if that one carries on. We started a new series on the Book of Revelation. Iain, give us a summary of the Book of Revelation in 60 seconds.
Wow. Okay. That's never been done before, has it? Yeah. I mean, the title for our series is Hope Over Fear. And that really, in many ways, is what Revelation is about. It's an invitation to see the world, the universe, and everything else from a God perspective. Revelation itself alludes to the opening of a veil, the appearing of true reality. So the idea is that we have access to an awareness of the world that is bigger and more significant than what we see with our human eyes. How do we see that vision? We see it through a biblically informed worship in the power of the Spirit. And I think that's really what I was trying to say on Sunday, was we to open up our eyes, ask God to open our ears so that we might see things as they truly are. The title of one of the commentaries that's really helpful is called I Saw Heaven Opened. And I think that really captures what Revelation is all about.
I want to do a bit of a startup question, a kind of pre the beginning of all of this series.
Definitely a pre-millennial joke in there somewhere. I'm not quite sure what it is.
Okay, well, moving on. Iain and Brody, as a child, I had a fear of Revelation as a book in the Bible. And I think probably it came from the fact that there was a lot of imagery that didn't make a great deal of sense to me, and language that was just slightly overwhelming. And also just fear of all things end times. It was just a bit overwhelming. Can you, firstly, is that more than just me? And secondly, what is the secret to unlocking all the good that is in Revelation as a book, the way to see it that doesn't feel like it's a scary book or a book that's hard to understand?
It's definitely more than just you, Jackie.
Thank you.
Just finished reading a book. I didn't like the title that the author chose. She called it Orphaned Believers, which touches on that, on her. It's more biography than anything else, on her kind of like fear of revelation and things like that. I think perhaps one of the things that we might be able to do during this series is unbunk. Is that the word? Debunk.
They all said together.
Some misunderstandings. So the end times, the end days start with Christ's resurrection, with his death. And in some respects, theologically, I think that all disciples at all time are equidistant to the end. Time's not linear, and particularly theological time is not linear. So we're all equidistant to the end. So we are living in the end days just as much as Paul was living in the end days. Just as much as John was writing to churches that were living in the end days. And that's one of the reasons that I think the book of Revelation speaks so powerfully to our own circumstances and situation.
Yeah, I could put my hand up as well and say that end days were treated as a threat and certainly were something that I was very fearful of. And I guess in many ways that's why so many of us avoid diving into Revelation, because it's quite triggering in some ways. And I think that's really ironic, because actually Revelation is intended to do exactly the opposite. It is intended to instill hope, confidence and assurance in people who are facing human threat. And one of the ways that I kind of, just as I was reflecting on this, Jackie, going into Sunday, was thinking about what is the meaning of fear or the meaning of anxiety. And one of the ways you can define anxiety or fear is to foresee a bad outcome. So we get fearful because our expectation is of a bad outcome, that the end of the world is going to be a frightful experience, or that we are heading towards a very threatening apocalypse, and that's even how that word is used. So that's what anxiety does. But hope is to foresee a good future. So actually, hope is in many ways the opposite of fear or anxiety. And what we want to do is to paint a picture, not just simply of a good future, but of a good present where Christ is present amongst the lampstands within the church, and Christ is reigning over history. So I think there's an awful lot that is there in Revelation to actually bring assurance rather than fear. And I suppose the reason that we have been fearful is that Revelation has so often been misused by God's people and misinterpreted. And I think, again, it's really important that we seek to reinterpret it in a way that I think it really was intended to be heard.
If I was to sell the book of Revelation, particularly to you, but perhaps more generally, then I would say, do you know what? Revelation's a book about worship. I like Michael Gorman's subtitle to his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly. And his subtitle is Uncivil Worship and Witness. Now, by uncivil, he's referring to kind of like civil worship, which is what, in one respects, that's the pressure that's on the churches there to worship the empire, to worship the Caesar. So a lot of Revelation, one of the glasses, the grids that we can read it through, is that this is talking about faithful worship and true worship. So it starts with this wonderful but strange and, in one sense, scary vision of Jesus as this is who we are worshipping. So it's a book about worship.
I think even to have titled the series, The Hope Over Fear, as you had on Sunday, Iain, is helpful, because I think to be encouraged as Christians to understand that there is so much to be gained by understanding it and not to run away from it is in and of itself helpful. And certainly understanding in the context of the rest of Scripture and so on, even the word, I think, apocalyptic literature, and understanding how that references Hebrew literature in the Old Testament, and what books that, you know, that we can pick up on and how they relate and make sense, as opposed to feeling just like this makes no sense. To be encouraged to look at it is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also part of the challenge because, you know, the Old Testament is a bit of a glossary for some of the language that's used in Revelation, but also, you know, there can be people who promote themselves as guides to that language, and perhaps the references that they're making from that are not really as helpful or as accurate as they should be. So I think it is good to revisit some of that stuff, because I think it lies in some of us in the back of our heads, and you know, that then seeps through into our thinking and perhaps our fear and anxiety about the world that we live in.
Yeah. And so just before I let Richard begin on his many enthusiastic questions, of which he's so excited about.
You think?
I know you are. Just a shout out for anyone who feels overwhelmed by it to check in with the Bible Project YouTube videos, which are a really helpful sort of overview of the book. And I always think the way that they present things make it feel really accessible and not overwhelming.
Yeah, we should do a regular shout out for the Bible Project as a kind of interpretation of the podcast.
You can't go recommending other podcasts unless they're also
YouTube,
recommending
though.
us.
No, but it's the YouTube we're talking about, though.
We'll get in touch with them. We'll get in touch with the lads and say, would you like to recommend our podcast? And we'll do a bit of quid pro quo. They can have introduction to our few hundred listeners, and we'll take their tens of thousands. It seems a perfectly reasonable exchange. Of all of the books, certainly in the New Testament, this one probably demands context setting the most in terms of its entirety. There may be other books in the Bible whereby there are passages that require you to understand the context on which a particular passage was set. But for Revelation, it's probably important to actually get some establishment as to what was actually going on in the world, what was going on in John's life when this was happening. Iain, can you give us just a quick update or re-education? Where was John? Why was John?
Yeah.
What was going on in the world when this was happening?
As well as might be opening a can of discussion, but I'm just rough guide. I think most people reckon that this occurred kind of the last decade of the first century, so probably around something like AD 96 or something like that. Other people might have other views, but that's kind of where I've landed. You're in a position now where the churches are facing much more significant persecution. The Emperor Domitian came in the middle of the last decade, really kind of ramped up the demand for worship. He had a kind of particular thing he wanted people to do to declare that Caesar was Lord. He wanted people to pronounce that and worship him by throwing incense and fire. And I guess a lot of people just did that because, well, you just want to go with the flow. But the Christians, certainly the majority of Christians in Western Turkey, decided that they weren't going to do that, weren't going to bow the knee, weren't going to submit and declare Caesar as Lord. And so there were implications for that. A lot of the implications were probably quite social, in terms of social exclusion from business contracts, but there certainly was persecution. We understand that this is the point at which Timothy was killed. The kind of reflection of contemporaries written suggests that Timothy was attacked by a crowd that got out of hand in the city of Ephesus and killed in the fight. So there were tensions that were going on at that time, and the church, remember, is just a really small little thing in the midst of a really, really mighty empire that's really totalitarian. It demands allegiance from every part of people's lives. It claims to be the purveyor of all truth, and anything else any dissent is stamped down on. So it's written to these people who are facing really significant threat in their lives, in every aspect of their lives.
In last week's episode, we, for the second time, actually touched on the kind of seatbelt culture of being careful and being afraid, if you like, to comment on what's going on in the world. Do we see some of those themes continued in the context of Revelation?
I think absolutely. We see people who are choosing to be brave in the midst of a very challenging environment, and I think that is an incentive to us. But I think the bigger incentive is that wider picture of God at work in the course of history, of Christ over history, and of Christ present amongst the churches, that I think we'll come back to when we think about lampstands.
Now, I don't know if you made this reference on Sunday because you are a film geek at heart, or if it's just something you've picked up along the way, but I particularly liked your relating that we need to read this like a Christopher Nolan film rather than a Steven Spielberg movie. And it generally got me thinking that actually back in the 80s, 90s, when Spielberg was at his, highest pomp, E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Indiana Jones, all the rest of it, that actually did relate. You could kind of tie that into a certain reading of Revelation. We need to know what this means. This happens and this happens and this happens. Narrative runs through it. Whereas nowadays, popular culture, i.e. Christopher Nolan, DC movies, Lord of the Rings trilogy, all the rest of it, we're much more used to things jumping about, things being out of time. In a Marvel movie, you can always go back in time. The movies that they release don't run in a sequence. There's the way in which they put the films out, but actually, if you want to watch them in chronological order, you need to watch them in a different order to which they were released. And I wonder whether actually we have a much easier time dealing with Revelation with that cultural background that we all experience now than perhaps we did, which is where our fear and all of that came from 30 years ago, when the culture was all about these big stories, these one character travelling through a thing, whether it be Star Wars or Indiana Jones or whatever. Or have I read too much into that?
No, I'm glad actually some people got the reference. I thought it might be quite niche. But I think it is that thing of, it is a vision. It is a visual disclosure, not a linear narrative. So Revelation is a capture of what John saw, and he was seeing different things. And perhaps one of the ways to think about this that I didn't use is to think about it as the windows that are on your computer. And you have a bunch of windows that are open. And you might think, oh gosh, there's a window in the news. There's something really interesting happening in the news. And you open up that window and you deep dive into it. And then you might actually, follow a little bit of a rabbit trail and can open another window, get some more information, and you go right down into the detail. And then you think, do you know what? Actually, maybe I should check my emails. And you kind of pull it back and you open another window. And I think Revelation kind of has that sort of character to it. Sometimes we're pulling right in on detail. And then we're pulling right back to large scope. And what John is trying to indicate in what he saw is not a revelation of a kind of linear timeline of what will happen, a kind of countdown to the end. It's actually a revelation of all the different things that are going on currently in the heavenly realms. So there are multiple things and multiple windows of what God is currently doing, and we can see from different angles, we can see from different perspectives, and so it's almost like multiple views of the same thing from different angles that we're seeing. And sometimes there might be a little bit of a linear thing, and there's sometimes we actually go back in time. We will be going back to Israel and the birth of the Messiah, which kind of is before John, as well as going into what's happening in the heavenly realms at this moment. So I think it's better to kind of see it as a visual disclosure through multiple windows rather than a timeline of history.
We just need to wait for the movie to come out that Chris Nolan directs, and then we're sorted. We'll understand it. Or even more confusing. Jack?
I was just going to say, I'm laughing at Iain being glad that you understood it because you've been excited about it in the car all the way home from church on Sunday. It's just been like, I just think this is such a great reference. It's so helpful. So
I just wanted an excuse to watch all these Christopher Nolan movies that I've been able to catch up on since COVID.
So the question will be, which Christopher Nolan film actually most closely resembles the structure of Revelation?
Revelation, I don't know. It's probably Inception or something
I
like
would
that.
think
But there
so.
we go. We're getting very niche now. we'll do one of those. Back in the day when big screens were novel things. That's what you would do in a church. You would put on a movie night, and then you'd have a discussion about how this related to the Bible. So maybe we need an Inception movie night on the big screen at QP, and then we'll have a discussion about the Revelation of John thereafter. So anyone that's interested in that, sign up somewhere. Let us know on Spotify. Brody, favourite Christopher Nolan movie?
So I'm the guy who went to a movie and somebody said, "Oh, that is," and named the actor. I think it was Kevin Costner. I was like, "Oh, is that who the actor was?" I just enjoy movies. I don't know who directs them. I don't know who's in them. Though in the most recent Indiana Jones Last Shot, my son is riding the bike. Just want to say that. But apart from that, I don't know who's in any movies.
Oh, hold on a second. No. Let's just roll that back a second. This is important. So run that one past us again, because it might be the only reason to go and watch that movie, because it's actually terrible, apparently.
So
but maybe the last scene's the best.
The last shot in which Indiana Jones is on a balcony on what is King Street in Glasgow. There are no balconies in King Street in Glasgow. And two cyclists turn left into Parney Street. One of them is my middle child.
Oh, there we go. Good stuff. Did he get... So was this as an official extra? I've been a film extra once or twice, and you always get as many bacon rolls as you can eat.
This was as an official extra.
Excellent.
Love that.
It's always good
Well
fun to
done.
do that. I had to play a dead German soldier in a canal in Falkirk once, but there
That
we
was
go.
you being-
That's a story for another
You're
day.
being typecast, Richard, again.
Typecast. Anyway, Brody, so the film references aren't going to make it for you. What was your highlight of what Iain was saying? Has he set it up nicely for you next week?
Yeah, because I think us understanding Revelation as, a field guide for living in a world which is hostile, a world in which our loves and our worship is constantly looks to draw that away from Jesus. So to start with this focus on, this is a letter written to 7 churches about how to worship faithfully, how to live faithfully, how to witness faithfully, how to flourish in their own way, in a way that can look very different to what the world might call flourishing. So yeah, that was a very helpful setup.
The first point that you delved into, Iain, on Sunday was I saw. So it's no surprise that we then went to I heard and I spoke. But let's start off with I saw. I've touched on it already, is about the revelation being, say what you see. What do you see? Write it down. Tell us what you're looking at. That feels like a really odd way to start. I mean, it's a revelation, but it's not about the revelation being interpreted to John. It's basically, look around you, say what you see, and then we'll deal with how it all hangs together. Why is I saw a key part of how we as Christians should be just witnessing to what we see without, if you like, having to filter it and interpret it and do all the rest of it? Why is that a good starting point?
I think the idea of what we see, whether that's an image or a metaphor, picture that's created in our minds, is far larger than a definition that we use in words. So Revelation is intended to extend our perception, not define something very specifically. So we'll see this all the way through, that there are images, some of them are cartoonish, some of them are weird, most of them are weird, but they quite literally blow your mind, and you know that when you get a picture of something. I'm now trying to think of a picture, but a picture speaks 1,000 words, doesn't it? That's the expression. So it conveys an awful lot very quickly without having to be kind of delineated quite specifically the way you would with a word. And a picture appeals to more than just our minds; it appeals to our imaginations as well. So there's a creation here, or a revelation of a world that John is offering, and he's inviting us to live with that kind of vision of that kind of a world. And so I think that's why the visual is so significant for us.
And is this just do we need to contextualize this in the way that other books of the New Testament were communicated to their authors, in that, as you say, they were written rather than seen and written? This is a picture paints 1,000 words. This was a book, a message delivered, I suppose, if you like, for the 21st century. It was a visual medium, as opposed to Paul sitting down, scribing out what he was inspired to write. Is the difference in that way in which the book was inspired significant to the way in which we read it?
I think as well, so he's writing to insiders, so he's not trying to communicate something to the general culture or society.
Okay.
He's writing to 7 churches, so it's insider language. I'm amazed that he even had papyrus to write on, in one sense. And as Iain said, a picture tells 1,000 words, so he's able to communicate so much with great brevity by using images. He's not going to get it. He's aware that his time is probably short, and there's an urgency to communicate this message to the churches. So he can't do Revelation 1, 2, and 3. He's not got time to do that. He's probably not got the papyrus to do that. I mean, papyrus is expensive. There's, so he's able to, by using these images, communicate a book that to have written it kind of like in another form would have been 3 or 4 times its length, at least.
Mm-hmm.
I think a wee shout out for the rest of the New Testament, because I think one of the things that we can do is to suggest that it is just very kind of technical and wordy. And I think for readers, for example, of Paul's epistles, get your head around the pictures. Paul paints lots and lots and lots of images, and they're packed into his text. So one of the ways which is really helpful to understand Paul, from my point of view, is that you get the picture. And if you see the picture, it really helps. I think there's also, reference here to, now here's a rabbit hole to go down, but to Jewish apocalyptic, which is a very specific kind of literature. So it's a coded literature that Christians with a Jewish background would understand. So there are certain things that have a resonance, certain characters. So, in the vision that John has, the feet of the risen Christ, the Son of Man, are of burnished bronze. And that's a reference to Daniel, and Daniel 7 kind of stands very central to Revelation as a whole. So there are encoded messages. So John just has to refer, and he's alluding to something that has already a whole host of imagery associated with it in the Old Testament. So again, he references the Son of Man, and that's a reference to Daniel 7, which then describes the Son of Man as one coming in the clouds with power and authority. So there's a whole host of understanding and scripture that already is embodied in some of the language of Revelation. So it's a reference back to apocalyptic literature, which actually kind of opens up some of the meaning. I think the other reason that it's so visual and so weird is, how on earth do you get a letter about the Roman Empire out under the noses of Roman guards who would be really reticent to allow any kind of dissident literature to to kind of get into the hands of anybody else. So it is, just like if you're trying to get a secret message out of prison, you put it in code language. So you put it in code language that other people that you're writing to would actually understand. And I think that's maybe more of a strategic reason for it, but I think that's another reason for the visual aspect to it.
Yeah, the Bible Project video actually starts by talking about apocalyptic Jewish literature and talking about the symbolic visions that reveal a heavenly perspective on history so that the present can be viewed in the light of its final outcome. And I wonder, just thinking about the whole part of I saw, how much of this is, because you also talked about projecting onto our souls a different view of what we of reality. I actually inserted into that of what we perceive as reality for myself, because it's the sense of what we see and what is, because we are seeing in part all the time in our own lives. And how important is that we have this understanding of what is yet to come, so and even is what is happening now in a spiritual context, because we see things so particularly blinkered in such a closed place, and this gives context to all of that.
It's vital to any kind of navigation. First lesson in navigation is know where you are, and I think Revelation very simply is about knowing where you are and knowing what world we live in. I think Brodie began by saying that we live in the last days, and in that sense that we live in the shadow of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, and that's very different from living in the shadow of an oppressive culture or regime. So, opening your eyes to where we're at, and opening your eyes to the fact, I think one of the commentaries says the simplest expression of revelation or understanding is Jesus has already won, and one day we'll see it. And that's the simple interpretation of this whole book. Jesus is the victor, and one day we'll see that in its completeness. And that makes a massive difference to how you live in the world. If you think Caesar has won, or Caesar maybe won, or has Jesus won, or maybe Caesar's won, if the battle is still going on, that affects you very differently in terms of how you live in the world.
Well, you did also ask in that section, you said, how do we see the Lord? And it is the moment of reflection, of thinking about, in any given circumstance and in any given situation, do we have it in the context of, to the best of our ability, in the context of this fuller situation, or do we keep it in a really narrowed down way? Brodie?
One of the key things, and Iain brought this out on Sunday, so here is a vision of the risen Christ, and he's standing in the middle of these 7 lampstands, and the lampstands are the churches. So he's not saying, don't be afraid, everything's going to be brilliant. He's saying, don't be afraid, I am with you. The one who was dead has been made alive. So he is in a context in which we know that in at least one of the churches, somebody has died. Iain's said that, Timothy probably died around this time as well. That's not the end. We need not be fearful of this. In fact, I hold the keys of death and Hades. So there's a message of hope, even in what many of us would perceive of what's the worst possible thing that could happen to us. And I think one of the things that's that the message of Revelation is, there's worse things than death.
So the story develops, if you like, from writing what you see to specifically writing what you hear to these 7 churches. First up, is there a context of these 7 churches? Are they related to each other anywhere else in the Bible? Are they just given to John as 7 examples to write to? Were these the only 7? Why these 7 churches? Just because of the problems they were experiencing? Or was there something else that linked these churches together? Geography, context, how they were founded? What do we know about them historically, Iain?
Well, I'm going to just keep my powder dry on that one, because I think Brodie's going to come up with some of that in a couple of weeks' time. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is, they're all kind of on a circuit round from Ephesus. So if you see Ephesus as being kind of
Right.
central hub city, and then these are sort of smaller cities that are on a kind of circuit. And interestingly, they are addressed in a clockwise direction. So they kind of there's a bit of a round route that the messages go around. I think maybe just to Jackie's point as well about how we see, I think this and how we engage with this reality of God's world. This is what was being heard by the churches was not information. It's described as prophecy. It is a timely word. It is a word in season that produces fruit. And so being addressed by God's word in Revelation actually imparts the strength and the courage that are required and the understanding of where things are at. So the actual consequence of reading Revelation is that we should be strengthened and supported for life in the world. That is its intention, and that's God's intention. So it's not just for informing us so that we can kind of be interested in what the end times might look like. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is to fortify God's people to stand in persecution. So actually the word itself conveys that.
Yeah, you touched on that later on, or towards the end, where you were speaking a bit about bond servants and kind of unpacking what a bond servant was. It was nothing to do with James Bond for more movie references. But so how does a bond servant differ from a servant?
Well, I think I was just really making the point that there was a voluntary aspect to that these were not people who were enforced into following Christ in this situation. So that was in some ways in contrast to the regime of the time that was really enforcing and coercing obedience. And God doesn't coerce that. He invites it in terms of our discipleship. So these are people who have freely chosen to follow Jesus. So when the pressure is on, there's a sense in which they have the option to get out of it and to escape and to comply with the state and with the empire. So there is a possibility here that they can recant their faith, but they're being called to faithfulness under that pressure. So I think that's, for me, that's part of it, that we are not just being compelled to follow here, but we are being invited to follow, even though it's challenging circumstance.
And you said that John brings a living word. He brings a revelation to lift eyes up, brings hope that isn't wishful thinking, it's tethered to reality. And I loved that, because so often we can think about hope as wishful thinking, or as, crossing your fingers in our current culture, that it's let's hope that the universe is going to do the best for us and so on. But when you consider that hope is tethered to reality, that's a challenging sentence to our hearts, I think. I think that our heads would hear it a lot, but I think for our hearts to feel like that is really the reality is quite a different thing. Or is that just me?
No, it's fundamental.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I don't think that's just you, Jackie. And I think one of the challenges we have with the way many of us kind of like have heard Revelation preached or read it ourselves is that we push all that hope into a distant future. And one of the things that Jesus reveals to John, that John reports, that Jesus says is, I am the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. And by that, he's not just saying, so it'll be all right in the end, but he's saying, because I am the end and I am present with you now, then the all right at the end is present with you now. So it's not just a case of cling on by your fingertips and it'll be okay someday in the future. It's saying that future is not in its fullness now, but so we still have Paul's kind of like now not yet at play in here of there is an aspect of that future present now which we can live in. And going back to kind of like the bond servant thing, Richard, of again, one of the things when we did the immerse thing and read through the New Testament, one of the things that struck me was the consistency of the message. So Paul kind of like emphasizes this not being coerced and talks about bond servants as well. And here's bond servants who get given crowns and white robes. So there's a contrast in what it means to be a citizen of heaven and how they're treated compared with a citizen of Rome, which is very precarious and very stratified. You're at the bottom. You have no chance. So there's that in it as well. So it's not just hope in the future, but it's a present hope, a living hope, a now hope, as well as there's more to come.
Brodie, you've already mentioned Jesus in the middle of his lampstands, and I want to come back to that in a minute. But as we're talking, I'm realising that I'm having my own little personal revelation, because when Richard and I discuss in advance of coming to record, the sort of general flow of the questions that we're going to ask, I really struggle because I'm so logical and I need things in order. So I'm always wanting to ask questions in the order of the way that Iain has preached it.
She's my Spielberg to my Christopher Nolan.
I'm literally realising, because Brodie talked about Jesus in the middle of the lampstands, which is further down, and we hadn't gone through that part yet. And then I'm realising, good grief, I'm Spielberg, Richard's Christopher Nolan. No wonder this is tricky.
And Jackie, you've now got me really worried because it's my order that I've followed through. Though I have to say, I read verse 16 and then we started off with verse 1. So I did kind of do a bit of a back to the future moment.
It's just a Marvel movie. I think we're going to write a new book. It's not going to be Men Are from Mars and Women from Venus. It's Men Are Nolan and Women Are Spielberg or something.
I don't think that's accurate. I mean, the seven lampstands is. I'm just saying the seven lampstands still is in chapter 1. So verse 20 talks about the seven lampstands, and of course, in Revelation, numbers mean something. So 7 is a number of completion.
Yes.
So. The significance
Absolutely.
of the 7 is carries that theological weight to it.
Yeah, totally agree, Brodie. It was more just that you referenced it and that Iain had talked about it in the sort of John saw him section, and it was further down, and I was feeling like, well, we hadn't covered off this bit yet. However, wanting to embrace you having mentioned the lampstands, Richard and I both felt that it was really wonderful how you said Jesus is in the middle of his lampstands. He's in the middle of his mess. And Brodie, you'd commented on that again. And I think there is something so wondrous about that, the sense that there he is in the middle.
I think it's a real standout for me just in preparing this. And actually, in many ways, this is I keep saying this is the message of Revelation and then saying something else. But in many ways, it is about the reality of Christ amongst his people that Revelation comes to express. So a wee quote, if I may, from I'm enjoying Discipleship on the Edge by Darrell Johnson as one of the commentaries that I've been reading. And he just puts this really very well. So if I may, let me read what he says. The presence of the risen and glorified Jesus is the great unseen reality of the present, right here, just behind a very thin veil, in the middle of the lampstands. And yeah.
It feels like you're having a lot of fun with this, Iain. It feels like, I don't know, you seem quite lit up by Revelation.
Yeah, well, I'm just doing the easy bits. Wait till we get to the beasts and
wait
all of that.
The dragons.
Yeah. We've got a lot more beasts to get around before we rest on our laurels.
I suppose we just say that this is just going to be like a Christopher Nolan movie, and we're not going to get all covered, and you'll need to watch and listen to the 14 sequels in order for us to go back in time and come back to chapter 1 and the rest of it, because we're going to need to draw this to a bit of a close. Otherwise, we're going to need to produce a part C for this week's series if we keep going much longer. I would just like to touch on one thing before that, which is I really like the verse 17. Do not be I felt his feet like a dead man, and he placed his right hand on me. I really like that image of the kind of hand on the shoulder. Don't worry, whatever you're seeing, it'll be all right. Don't panic. I know this may be a bit scary, and you're seeing dragons and lampstands, but I'm here, right hand on the shoulder. And I really like that. But that's the bit I really liked. What was the bits that you really like as your final takeaway? Brodie, give us your one final word.
Oh, one final word. Come back to me. My brain's gone blank.
Brodie's going to go out of linear time, and so we'll pass on to Jack.
Well, can I just sort of come back to your hand on the shoulder thing? Mm-hmm. I don't wish to put you in a really vulnerable spot. However, we're all vulnerable all the time, so it's definitely your turn. Right. It feels like there's something really significant in that, the sort of sense of fathering, of hand on your shoulder, of I have you, I've got you, the sense of being looked after. Do you not think that's kind of amazing? Yeah,
absolutely. I suppose we've not quite entered the real craziness of Revelation yet. You know, we're not dragons and folk on horses, but already you've got to do a film reference, if it's not all, it'll be all right in the end, and if it's not all right, it's not the end. There's that kind of feeling about it of, yeah, it's okay, don't panic. It's a big don't panic mug or towel if you're into Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or whatever. It's okay,
but it's almost
your dad's got you.
To go back to the movie thing, if you've gone to see a movie that your parents are worried that you're scared of, it's like your dad sitting beside you saying, it's okay, I'm here. Like,
yes,
you can't be. Sorry.
The
too many movie references.
It's a new film club show coming from Queen's Park Baptist Church.
I've got a final thought now,
It's
Richard.
A scary bit in E.T. or whatever. Go on, right, Brodie's back. Yep. Take us away. Get us out of this.
So I think Iain did a really good job. I think the hard thing with all of this is in what you have to leave out, because you can't cover everything on a Sunday morning, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing the podcast. So just a heads up and this is where scholars who read Revelation will disagree, but I'm quite firm on this, of the sword that Jesus has is not in his hand, it's in his mouth. And Jesus is not the violent one in Revelation. And I learned what a double-edged sword, the significance of a double-edged sword, through Victor Hugo in Les Mis. So if you read that book, there's a barricade scene in which somebody has a double-edged sword, and they strike forward with it, and as they hit the person who's coming over the barricade, the weight of that person presses the sword against them and cuts them also. And so as we use the word of God, so it changes the world round about us, but it also changes us because it's double-edged. So if we want the word of God to change us, we need to be using the word of God.
Brodie, you have made Richard so happy.
Yes, Jack, explain why Brodie's made me happy.
Because last night you were talking about the double-edged sword and how brilliant it is, and how much you'd had to look up about it, and how you were thinking about it, and how it had impacted you. And I was like, no, that's not the thing. Look, there it is. It's the thing.
Brodie, thank you, sir. Iain, you preached it. You can have an attempt at one final word.
There's just so much in that, isn't there? And I think there's a whole separate podcast on a double-edged sword for you guys to kick off. I think just little, large, massive reflection from the end, which is that Jesus emerges as the one who holds the keys to death and hell. And fear is about the fear of loss and destruction. our anxiety, and the anxiety probably of the first hearers was that they might lose what they had, certainly lose their lives. And here we have this revelation that the keys to death itself are not in the hands of the oppressors or of those who are threatening us, but Jesus himself has gone deep into death and has come out with the keys of death and hell in his hands. And so we actually enter the whole book, with the answer. There's no question about who's the winner. The winner is already holding the keys as we enter the whole Revelation. So I think we can enter the book and enter the story and enter this series knowing where we're going to come out. It's not going to be in a place of fear, but in a place of hope, because he already holds the keys of death and hell.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you, Iain. Brodie, is it yourself preaching this weekend?
No, it's not. We have a guest.
Oh, who do we have?
Well, we have a special Alpha focus this coming weekend. So we have Des Johnson, who's one of the Alpha people. And Des is going to come and tell us about Alpha and why it's great to invite people to hear about the message of Jesus over a period of time on the Alpha course. So with stories, testimonies, and information about Alpha. So that's what's coming this Sunday.
Good stuff. Get in touch with us. Email office@qpbc.org. Do go on to Spotify and send a message. And as was pointed out this weekend, when you put your message on there and they then get published for everyone else to see, and it says the creator has published your message, it's not that creator, it's just me publishing it. It's not some higher power has seen your message and decided that actually it's okay for the rest of the world to see it. But it'd be really great if you want to go on and leave the show a message and share a thought that everybody else can see as well. We published them with a couple last week, so go and use the Spotify app if you have it to check those out. But other than that, it's goodbye from all of us. Have a great week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.